Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Megan Trush, and I am the Director of Research Partnerships at the Diversity Institute at Toronto Metropolitan University. I'm pleased to welcome you on behalf of the team leading this initiative through ESDC's Workplace Opportunities Removing Barriers to Equity program. Before we begin, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. I'm joining you today from Toronto, which is situated on the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Toronto is also covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. As we come together to discuss equity and inclusion in workplaces, it's important to reflect on the ongoing impacts of colonialism and our responsibility to advance reconciliation in all sectors. Today's session, EDI in Federally Regulated Sectors, A Practical Guide to Inclusive Design, is part of a broader effort to support organizations subject to the Legislated Employment Equity Program in strengthening their capacity to create inclusive and equitable workplaces. I'm thrilled to be joined by Dr. Wendy Sukier. Wendy is a professor of entrepreneurship and innovation at the Ted Rogers School of Management, founder and academic director of the Diversity Institute at TMU, academic director of the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, and academic research director of the Future Skills Center. She brings deep expertise in working with organizations across sectors to leverage principles of EDI as a competitive advantage, and will be sharing insights to help us approach this work with confidence. Please feel free to share Q&A in the chat box throughout the session, and we will have time for discussion following the presentation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Wendy to get us started.
Thanks so much, Megan. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate in particular the folks who have come to more than one session. I'm going to share my slides and hopefully this will work. Is that good, Megan, on your end?
Yep, that's good.
And we're a small enough group today that I would really love if people have comments as we're going along. I'm not good at managing the chat, but Megan can help get my attention focused on any comments or questions that come through. So today we're here to talk about a practical guide to inclusive design. And many of you know that we have quite a wide range of courses, learning materials, and so on through the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, through the Future Skills Center, and of course through the Warby Project. So I'll just start with a little background on the Diversity Institute and our approach, why we think design is important, and some of the principles and examples of inclusive design and how they may apply to federally regulated corporations. Very often we think of inclusive design in the context of manufacturing, and some of those principles are indeed important, but we also need to apply them to every stage in the value chain. So I think most of you know who we are. The main thing about the Diversity Institute is we're pretty big. We have about 80 full-time staff. We've been around for a while. We have 10 hubs across the country. But most importantly, we are located in the business school. And because we're in the business school, we're really preoccupied with how equity, diversity, inclusion, truth and reconciliation, accessibility, all help organizations be more effective. And so while we're committed to social justice and human rights, we have lots of data, lots of evidence that shows very clearly as Canada is changing, so must organizational practices. Because think about it, with the change in population, we need to tap into diverse talent. We need to think about markets changing and new products and services. We know very clearly that diverse minds bring more innovation and creativity, that, for example, immigrants are more likely to be entrepreneurs than others. They have deep knowledge of international markets at a time when many organizations are trying to break into new markets, as are our former best friend is no more. And then, of course, there are also legal and reputational costs and risks, particularly as many of you have regulatory and legislative requirements. So, when we think about equity, diversity, and inclusion, truth and reconciliation, I would basically say it's marketing 101. As Canada's population is changing, so must our practices. Racialized people are now a third of the Canadian workforce. Women are the majority of university graduates and make well over half purchasing decisions. Immigrants are now almost a quarter of the population. 27% of Canadians, and this is considerably larger than it was even 10 years ago, 27% of Canadians identify as having one disability. Part of this is because we've broadened our understanding of disability to include cognitive differences, mental health, and so on. It's also associated with the aging population. I had my first cataract surgery, for example. I am testament to that process. And we also know that an increasing proportion of youth identify as 2S LGBTQ+, but even more importantly, a growing percentage of the overall population identify as allies. And then we know that Indigenous peoples are one of the fastest growing segments of the population, particularly when we look at young people. So, really, from the point of view of equity, diversity, and inclusion, and why inclusive design is so important, we know that as markets change, so must practices. We've got lots of data, lots of evidence that shows that organizations that consider equity, diversity, and inclusion in their product development, in their marketing, in their service delivery tend to do better than those who don't. And we also know it has to do with reputation and brand management as well. Now, of course, there's the flip side of that is if you engage in diversity washing, and get caught, it can cost you dearly. So authenticity is absolutely essential. We also know, and this is, this research is a little bit old, but it still applies, that more diverse firms have more innovative products and services, and that translates into financial benefits. And we also know that most of you who I think are attending this particular webinar are federally regulated, and you have obligations. If you're subject to employment equity legislation, you have obligations around not just reporting on diversity at different levels within your organization and the relationship to the labor market, but also what your policies and practices are. And we know that inclusive design is important, not just in terms of how you design and implement your recruitment and employment systems, although those are really important. We've talked about HR in other sessions, so I won't go into that in so much detail, but also in terms of product and service delivery, communications and technology, and your infrastructure. And of course, we also know that organizations that do a good job with inclusion and are explicitly committed to equity, diversity, and inclusion are able to attract and retain employees, and to improve their performance, as opposed to organizations which do not. And we've seen lots of evidence of people voting with their feet if they're lured into a company that advertises itself as being diverse and it proves not to be. And again, we have lots of research that demonstrates this. Federally regulated companies are also not just subject to the Canadian human rights legislation and to provincial legislation. Ontario, for example, has the Accessibility Act. No, AODA, Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. But now we have the Accessible Canada Act at the federal level, which also is focused specifically on accessibility for persons with disabilities. One of the things that you'll see today in my presentation is that when I talk about inclusive design, I'm talking about accessibility for persons with disabilities, but I'm talking about accessibility for a full range of people with differences, whether it's based on gender, whether it's based on race, Indigenous peoples, as well as persons with disabilities.
Cindy?
There are also, sorry, is there a comment? Yeah.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat that says, I think it was in reference to the slide before last, saying, can you share some examples for communications and technology?
Yes, I will, for sure. In terms of accessible communications and technology,
Thanks.
yes, I absolutely will. We'll get to that in a moment. And in fact, one of the things that's emerging are standards for precisely that. For example, for AI systems, we're seeing as we're developing responsible AI standards and voluntary codes, access, inclusion, and fairness are critically important. And this means not just ensuring that people are able to use the systems, but to ensure that the systems are not discriminating against people because they have embedded bias. So we're starting to see, and it's not surprising, I'm sure, to people around the virtual room, that a lot of the initial standards are indeed focusing specifically on IT and technology products and services. So often in the past, we thought about accessibility being associated with curb cuts and wheelchair ramps and accessible washrooms and physical accessibility. But increasingly, there is focus on digital accessibility as well. And again, this is not simply accessibility in terms of, voice recognition for people who are visually impaired or uh, or or other assistive technologies. This is accessibility writ large, really thinking about ensuring that technologies can be used by everybody. I hope that answers the question, but we've got some more technical examples as we go along. I'm happy to talk more about that. And some of you, one of the things we can do is send you follow-up information. So if you put questions in the chat that we don't get to, or if there are specific kinds of information that you want, for example, we've been doing a lot on designing AI systems and how you address bias, et cetera, et cetera. If anyone's interested in more detail, do put notes in the chat because we track the chat and we always make sure that we do follow up as well. So thank you for that. One of the things, I don't know if people on the call have heard of the book called Invisible Women. It was published maybe 5 years ago, but it had a litany of examples where products and services were designed by men for men, and as a result did not work for women. And I don't know if anyone else on the call has had this happen, but voice recognition systems very often do not recognize women's voices. Infrared faucet sensors in bathrooms often do not recognize skin that isn't white. But it gets worse. We know from the book Invisible Women and other research that's been done, products that are designed without an EDI lens can actually be dangerous. And so some of you have probably heard me say this before, that the crash test dummies that historically were used to design automobile safety systems. And I started my career at the Ministry of Transportation and Communications. So this could, you could search and replace for other environments which are intended to regulate for safety, because the anatomy of the crash test dummies was based on male anatomy. Women are far more likely to be severely injured during car crashes. We also know that during COVID, for example, protective gear and systems were typically designed for men, not women, and that creates problems. And it's true on construction sites across the country. We also know that for those of you who work more in the development of policies and programs, that not bringing an equity, diversity, and inclusion lens to the design of the programs can mean they actually don't work. And one of the most powerful examples of this, I don't know if some of you have heard Dr. Kwame McKenzie from the Wellesley Institute speak about Toronto Public Health during COVID. But when they started, they found that the infection rates among the Black community were 7 times as high as among everyone else. Now, why would this be? Well, it had to do with a number of factors. Poverty, for sure, the overrepresentation of Black people in frontline roles that exposed them to the virus, the conditions under which many people lived, high rises, crowded conditions, and also the history of slavery, anti-Black racism, institutional anti-Black racism, and so on, probably also meant that there were that there were issues with the levels of trust. There were also issues in terms of access to programs. If you're working long hours in a service and living on the outskirts of the city, it's hard to get to the facilities where the COVID vaccinations were available, and so on and so on. And Dr. McKenzie and his team designed a very specific program with outreach, with lots of community engagement and so on. They were able to reduce that gap in the infection rate. So 700 times as many Black people were being infected as others. They reduced it to parity over a matter of months because they intentionally considered the needs of the Black community in designing that program. So lots and lots of cases where a lack of attention to these things result in mixed opportunities. And if you develop products and services, and many federally regulated companies do, you have to think about the fact that markets are shaped now by immigrants and racialized people, and that may lead to different needs for products and services and preferences, whether it's their telecommunications choices, whether it's language of communication, whether it's habits, and so on and so forth. We also know that for those of you who are involved in infrastructure or have operations, part of your operations are physical assets. We know that the mainstreaming of recognition of differences in gender identity and sexual orientation have led to new requirements in building design and products and services. We know that the increase in religious diversity has led to increased demand for things like prayer rooms in public spaces, and so on and so forth. We know that, it's interesting. I forget which airport I was at recently, but they have booths now for breastfeeding women. And as women are moving into more and more positions of power, there are more and more efforts to accommodate women's overrepresentation in caregiving with different services. And I remember a few years ago, a friend of mine who was legal counsel at the university sent me a cover page from one of the legal magazines, and it was a picture of, the partners in a law firm, and they were all old white men. And she sent me a note saying, as if I would ever do business with them. So that's the other thing we have to recognize, is that as the decision makers become more diverse, they're going to be looking for more diverse suppliers. And certainly many large federally regulated organizations, governments, and private sector alike are building in commitments around diversity to their procurement decision making. We also know that with the aging population, with the increase in the percentage of the population with disabilities, there are opportunities to design new products and services. And, it was interesting. I was with my sister's mother-in-law for her 98th birthday the other day, and she's hard of hearing and has a hearing aid that doesn't work very well. And we all sort of sat around playing with our iPhones and got, the voice recognition piece of it working. So she could actually not just try to read people's lips in the conversation, but could actually engage much more actively in the conversation, because she had real-time transcription to help support her understanding of what was going on around her. And the advances in some of the tools to promote inclusion for persons with disabilities are mind-boggling. Some of the things that we've seen. What I find strange, however, is a lot of corporations are not investing in these tools to help maximize the productivity of their employees. And of course, as I said, with the aging population, these things have to be considered. And we've done, not talking about it in this particular presentation, but we've done a lot of work on the digital divide. And the digital divide is often associated with differences in access to infrastructure. So we think of people living in rural and remote communities. We think of Indigenous peoples, many of whom don't have running water. They certainly don't have access to high-speed internet, and so on and so forth. And there's been real progress made in access to infrastructure. But access to internet is not just about access to the physical infrastructure, although that is also an issue. It's also about affordability. And we did research with Environics that showed well over a third of immigrants, and you could search and replace Indigenous people, racialized people, and so on, couldn't afford even cell phones as well as high-speed internet. We did research that showed during COVID, 32% of racialized youth in Toronto, which has high-speed internet everywhere, 32% of racialized youth were doing their homework on cell phones, because they didn't have access to computers. They didn't have access to high-speed internet. They might be a family of 5 and everybody's vying for use of the same device and bandwidth and so on and so forth. And when you think about that, that has huge implications for digital government, for digital services. I mean, I have access to internet and devices, and I can afford them. And I have a PhD in information systems, and I hate two-factor authentication. I hate it. I hate chatbots. Every time you send me a chatbot, I say this to all the banks on the phone. Every time I get a chatbot, I type, "Give me a human, give me a human, give me a human," with exclamation marks in caps. So it's really important to recognize that just because some people want digital everything, and just because some people live online, there's still significant segments of the population who don't want it, don't need it. I mean, one of the best innovations from my point of view is that many of the airlines, banks, retailers now have lines for seniors, which allows me to exercise my preference for humans over chatbots. Yes, so I already talked about some of this is just a bit more about the mechanics of why seatbelts and airbags did not work for women. And it was partly because we tend to be shorter. And so we were tending, if we were driving, to be closer to the steering wheel. And that had very negative effects. We know that airport body scanners often discriminate against people in and will identify issues where perhaps there are none. These things become incredibly embarrassing and personal. We know that speech to text software often mistranscribes people based on their pronunciation or their accents. And as I said, they often didn't recognize women's voices. We know that the ways in which AI systems are being trained often has big implications as well. I see there's actually lots of comments in the chat, so I'll pause for a moment, Megan, to give you a chance to catch me up.
Yeah, this is a great point to pause, as there was a comment in the chat from Yannick saying, I've had the same difficulty because you have to talk to a robot before having a human, and the robot does not recognize accents.
Absolutely.
I personally am in an ongoing feud with the Google devices in my home because they interact perfectly with my male partner, but they do not listen to me at all. It drives me up the wall. There were a few requests for, we will be sharing the deck after the session, as I noted in the chat. Interested in receiving resources around accessible AI design. Yeah, I think a fair bit of interest from those on the line for the resources that we're going to share afterwards, but that's
excellent. And remember, I don't know if Megan mentioned it, but at least till the end of March, we are funded by the Government of Canada to help federally regulated organizations improve their EDI strategies. So if there's anything we can do for you between now and the end of the year, end of fiscal, please reach out because we have lots of custom stuff and we have KPIs to hit. So thanks. The recognition, training of AI systems, I have a whole presentation on AI bias. Some of the examples are horrifying, just horrifying. That's all I can say. And unfortunately, a lot of the worst examples are in public sector or quasi-public sector applications of AI where the discrimination is terrible. Yeah, I mentioned the detectors in the washrooms that don't recognize skin. We've heard a lot about facial recognition and those issues. We also know that facial recognition systems often are racially biased, and there are lots of examples of that. So when we think of the way forward, our perspective is that what we need to do is to mainstream commitments to equity, diversity, and inclusion across the value chain. So at every stage of development, whether we're looking at procurement, whether we're looking at product design, whether we're looking at your infrastructure development, whether we're looking at customer service, whether we're looking at your HR policies and practices, or your marketing and outreach, every single element of the business should bring to it an equity, diversity, inclusion, truth and reconciliation, and accessibility perspective. because if you bake this orientation into everything you do, that is when you will really achieve the overarching benefits, as opposed to having a strategy that sits separate from your overall corporate strategy. So when we think of inclusive design, we think about it as part of organizational design. And, those of you who know about inclusive design know it's user-centered, it's thinking about accessibility, not just people with physical differences, but everybody who is diverse, and customization, because preferences play into this as well, as you've heard with my ongoing battle with chatbots. Uh, and when we think about inclusive design, often people interpret it fairly narrowly, and certainly from a legislative perspective, you can interpret it fairly narrowly. We interpret it broadly. So we want organizations to think about inclusive design in their leadership strategies. If you are a member of a board, how are you conducting your meetings? Are your meetings including everyone at the table? And I can give you two examples of people who were put on boards and felt that they were not included. One was a woman who was hearing impaired, and she did not use sign language, because often the default for dealing with people who are hearing impaired is to have American Sign Language. She read lips. And so if you did not face her when you were speaking to her, she couldn't understand what you were speaking. It was saying it was a very simple procedural thing in the meetings, but it was very difficult for her to participate, and nobody thought to ask her what would be helpful. So that was one example. The second example was an Indigenous woman, very senior partner in a big consulting firm, CA, scary smart. But when she joined her first board, she found the processes of decision making and discussion very alienating. The focus on voting and the way in which arguments played out and so on, because she was accustomed to a much more collegial and collaborative approach to decision making. Um, and there are obviously cultural differences that can come into play where, you know, North Americans are often, especially North American men, are often conditioned to promote themselves, promote their ideas, participate, etc. People from other cultures may value deference and modesty and and respect for authority. And we see this in the classroom all the time, where there are some, and I was a bit like this, I know, I know, I know, and other people who never say a word unless they're specifically called on for their opinion. So even at the board level, quite apart from the issues around representation, how you design your board meetings, and obviously this goes through the organization, can have a profound impact on inclusion, human resources, how you design your jobs, what you assume are the requirements in the job. Because often we recruit based on our own image. So, if I'm an engineer with a project management degree or certification, I am going to look for other engineers with project management certifications without asking myself the question, are those actually requirements to do the job properly? Often the language that is used in job descriptions will alienate certain people or not make them feel welcome. And I remember one case, it wasn't a federally regulated corporation, it was a small business in, I think, Picton, Ontario, where they said they were having trouble recruiting and retaining qualified staff. And even when they advertised and invited people to interviews, they'd get ghosted. I thought that was only something that happened on dating, but it happens for job interviews as well. And they made one change to their job advertisements. They said internationally educated professionals welcome. They doubled the number of applicants and dramatically improved the quality of people who applied for the job. That to me is inclusive design, right? Thinking about how you're designing your advertisements, your outreach, and so on. Thinking about how you're designing your culture, how you are reinforcing the values, how you are, one of the organizations we worked with actually, as part of performance reviews at all levels of the organization, ask questions about what you've done over the last year to advance the culture and values at the organization. So there are ways to really think about inclusive design, in a very holistic manner, making sure that you have performance measures that track these things. And what I'm going to talk about more today is specifically how inclusive design applies through the value chain, through the development of products and services. And so the product development life cycle, different people have different models, but usually it starts with ideation and brainstorming, and then you define requirements, you design something, you test it, and you launch it. And what's really important when we think about the product development life cycle is to think about this as an iterative approach where you design, build, test, design, build, test, and engage diverse people through the process. And so it's really, like, I would argue, and I think there's good research to support this, you don't have to be a member of an equity deserving group to do inclusive design, but it helps. Without question, it helps to have people with lived experience as part of design teams. So I do think there's a significant connection between inclusive design and representation in employment and leadership. And that for me is a really important connection, especially for organizations that have obligations under employment equity legislation. It's very important, especially as we're doing more and more, as was mentioned, more and more digital design, to recognize that bias exists in our historic data. And if our processes are automated or digitized based on those historic practices, we're simply going to embed bias in those processes. And so inclusive design is particularly important for digital design because often you can't see what's going on. I mean, if you have a bathroom that is inaccessible, you can physically observe someone not being able to get in or through the door or whatever. But when it comes to data sets and information systems, often the bias is not visible. And so it's really important to be aware of that and make sure that our testing, prototyping processes take that into account. Training is, in my experience, one of the least effective ways to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion. I know some of you have probably heard me say that before, but I use the example of from my early days in transportation, how we reduce speeding, right? And so, how do you reduce people who are speeding on the road? Well, you can say, don't speed, speed kills, etc. And for some people, that may make them more cautious, but it's one of the least effective ways to change behavior. It's like telling me if I eat too much and don't exercise, I'll get fat. I have that information. It does not change my behavior. The next level is you develop laws and regulations and you make sure you enforce them. So there's education, the first D, enforcement is the second D. And some people will obey laws, but we know that lots don't. And, in Toronto, they're cutting down the photo radar um, detectors all over the place. So that tells you something about people's respect for the laws and the regulations, or they're hiding their license plates and so on and so forth. So enforcement can make a difference, but it depends. Economics can make a difference too. So you increase the fines from $500 to $50,000. That can really help, particularly if there's certainty that people will get apprehended and punished and so on. But what is the most effective way of reducing speeding? Speed bumps. Because if you speed, it is going to rip out the bottom of your car. And that's engineering. So when we think about highway safety, when we think about smoking cessation, when we think about obesity control, that's the hierarchy. Education's the lowest level, then you have enforcement, then you have economics. Think about smoking, they increase the taxes, that has big impact. But the what we really need is engineering. And engineering our systems to be inclusive, therefore, in my view, is something we have to think a lot more about. And when I talk systems, I'm not just talking about, the car crash safety systems. I'm talking about our policies, our programs, and our services across the board. So when we think about disability, for example, we have to recognize there are different types of disabilities. There are also different levels of severity. And, looking at people with disabilities as one clump simply won't meet their needs. When we think about gender and product design, we know that there have been all sorts of studies that show that the fact that almost all industrial designers are men has a real impact on the development of products and services in terms of the values, in terms of the functionality, terms of how they're used, the aesthetics, and so on. And when we think about race, we know that a lot of products use white as the default. And I was a friend of mine's daughter was a ballerina, and she actually designed ballet tights in different skin colors. And you'll remember the Band-Aids when they came out with Band-Aids that have different skin tones, because Band-Aids, which were designed to match my skin, obviously don't match everybody's. So really thinking about race and what the implications are impacts everything from consumer products to facial recognition to our security and surveillance systems, and so on and so on and so on. And that's why we talk about this notion of diversity and inclusion through the value chain. And I would encourage you to really think about your organization, break the clumps down, and ask yourself the questions. Procurement, we know lots of organizations are now starting to think about diversity and inclusion in procurement. I'm going to go through this next set of slides very quickly, but we'll make them available to you because not everyone's going to be interested in all of the examples. We know that accessibility in media is becoming more and more important, and there are lots of ways in which this is being factored in to television programming, to media consumption, to interactive applications. Marketing and communications, increasingly recognizing that audiences are different. And so imagery has to change if it's going to work. And yet we have to try to avoid tokenism as well. And it's often a very delicate line. We have a whole thing on marketing and communications. But what we're starting to see is organizations coming up with sort of counter stereotyping images to really challenge our assumptions in a significant way. And we see, I like this because Ireland used to have quite regressive practices on a lot of things, and they actually became sort of at the forefront of advancing to us LGBTQ plus inclusion with their through the bus service. TD, and all the banks have stuff. We just picked the ones that were in our best practices database, which you can have access to. But TD has a hub that really focuses on inclusive design right across the products and services, including personas, and a persona template that allows them to really think in a tangible way about different market segments and intersectional identities. Because remember, all women are not the same. Racialized women have different experiences. Immigrant racialized women have different experiences. Immigrant racialized women with trauma have different experiences. And so while we recognize that in the current employment equity legislation, there are 4 designated groups, and we think that the government may move forward with the recommendations of the Blackett Commission around adding Black people and the 2S LGBTQ plus community to the existing groups, which are women, racialized or visible minorities, Indigenous peoples, and persons with disabilities. But those intersections are also really important. And, I learned this when we did research in Toronto on representation on boards, and we found that women were gradually making progress. But in a city where half the population was racialized, white women outnumbered racialized women 7-1, 700% more of the women on boards were white rather than racialized. And so we really have to be attentive to those issues. And I know as a woman, I have to really be aware of the differences that Black women, racialized women, Indigenous women, and others experience. We've seen really interesting examples of federally regulated companies targeting very specific markets through their marketing programs, and the results have been well documented. I think everybody knows the Bell has sort of championed some of the progress around awareness of mental health issues as well as part of its corporate social responsibility. TELUS has really doubled down on improving access to internet connectivity for people with disabilities, and most of the telcos also work to improve access in Indigenous communities. We know that Via Rail, among other transportation companies, has worked hard to improve access, physical access, with a variety of techniques, not just to help people book their tickets, but also once they are on the railway. And we also know that lots of corporations have strong connections with people in the community to try to strengthen their design processes by engaging with people from different or different identity groups. And the principle of nothing about us without us, I think, is absolutely critical. And we see that across the board. So from our perspective, we really believe that organizational practices from stem to stern in organizations need to bring an equity, diversity, inclusion, accessibility, and truth and reconciliation lens in order to be successful, because it helps them attract new talent, it enhances staff retention, and we know the principle of representation in the organization dramatically improves the ability to support customers, clients, citizens who are diverse. And this was something the banks probably figured out before just about anybody. If you think about it, they really doubled down on attracting and retaining diverse employees quite early on, in part because they knew that having someone who spoke Mandarin in Markham at a branch was likely to enhance their ability to attract people from the Chinese communities. So, it's good business, is what I would say. And if you're in the public sector, it's what you need to do in order to serve diverse Canadians. Also, making sure that we bring this lens of intentionally thinking about bias, and especially when we're talking about some of the new technologies, making sure that what gets measured gets done. So having KPIs that are beyond what you're required to do with employment equity. I mean, I would argue that um, uh, tracking diversity among customers is also, and citizens is also important in terms of understanding whose needs are being met and whose aren't. And often, if you look at, we've been doing work with Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment, for example. It's not federally regulated, but it's owned by Rogers, which is. And it's very clear that, you can analyze the current customer base for Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment, but then you need to ask yourself the question, who isn't part of their customer base and why? So making sure that you have good data, not just on who works in the organization, but who you're serving, satisfaction rates, complaint rates, all of those things become very important in ensuring you have strong EDI practices that really support your organizational objectives. And then, with ethical AI applications, all of the guidelines focus on avoiding bias and embedding inclusion to mitigate risk. So thank you very much for your time. I think there are a couple more questions perhaps, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, there was a question comment in the chat. It says biases are not visible. I'm also worried about names or identities where a group is given a name that reflects their true identity, but at the same time evokes biases. How can this be resolved?
That's a really, really good question. And it's interesting because I don't know if any of you have experienced this or not, but we imported a lot of the language around race from the US. So we refer to the US now talks about typically African Americans, but in the past they referred to the Black community. One of the things we learned now is that many people in the Black community are immigrants. It's about 60%, between 50 and 60%. A lot of people come from Africa. In Africa, and Mohammed Elmi, our executive director, talks about this. In Africa, you're not Black.
You're
It's
just a
the
person.
concept of being Black is actually something that is quite alienating. We also know that many people are not comfortable sharing their identity. Many people, especially if they have invisible differences, persons with disabilities, a lot of Indigenous peoples who are not immediately identifiable as Indigenous do not self-identify because of the fear of bias and marginalization. So it's a really, really good, it's a good comment, and um, we know that it can, especially in some organizations, make people feel more marginalized rather than included. And so we really have to leave it upon people to self-identify, to decide if they want to be part of the Black employee resource group rather than saying, oh, you're Black, you have to do this. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, and I think also about like creating environments where disclosure of identity feels safe will lead to more disclosure of identity, right? Were there any other questions in the chat? I know we're at time.
Seems not. So listen, thank you all of you for taking the time to join us today. We're absolutely sincere. Anything you need for the next 21 days, 20, however many days are left in the month, we're happy to help to the extent we can. And we will make sure that the slides and other materials are shared with all of you. And I would just ask as a favor if you make sure that um, you uh, uh, fill in the evaluation. And there's one last question. Are employees who identify with protected grounds with respect to the CHRA protected in Employment Equity Act or other laws from discrimination when wearing items reflecting their identities? That's such a good question, especially in the current environment where geopolitical global events have led many organizations to restrict at the workplace certain identity symbols. So when you think about designated groups, when you think about the groups protected by human rights, there are issues in the province of Quebec, for example, around religious symbols. Um, but questions around national identity, political views, whose flags you wear, things like that, I don't know have been tested in the courts, but I think it's a good question and something organizations need to really think about. So thank you for that.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Wendy, for sharing your insights and expertise with us today. Your reflections on the complexities of inclusive design gave us a lot to think about. To everyone who joined us, thank you for taking the time to be a part of this important discussion. The webinar is part of a broader series of activities we're delivering through the Warby program focused on supporting federally regulated employers in strengthening their equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts. If you are a representative of a LEAP employer and want more information, please don't hesitate to reach out to me directly. Thanks again for being here, and until next time, take care and keep up the good work.